my GPS was dead. The satellite connection had been completely severed 5 miles ago, leaving the digital screen frozen on a grid of meaningless static. The air around me was a thick, gray nightmare of freezing fog and relentless horizontal snow that felt like crushed glass against my exposed skin. The coordinates I was blindly following, decrypted from a highly classified, coded Soviet distress signal dated January 1978, simply pointed to a precise location on the ice in the deepest, most desolate sector of Lake Baikal. This place is not merely a lake. It is an ancient inland sea over a mile deep, and it guards its own terrifying secrets with a brutal cosmic logic that defies human understanding. I had fought against the screaming Arctic wind for 3 agonizing days, my body numb to the core by the negative 40-degree temperatures, subsisting on half-frozen rations and the sheer adrenaline of the unknown. And finally, through a brief, violent break in the blizzard, I found it. It was a terrifying, perfect anomaly. Resting completely alone on the pristine black, miles-thick ice, not frozen into the surface, but sitting heavily on top of it as if it had just manifested from thin air, was a massive circular Soviet bathyscaphe. It was a complete iron relic, a ghost from the Cold War. A perfect, scarred steel sphere, covered in impossibly thick layers of flaking deep red rust and frozen, jagged corrosion. On the top curve of the hull, faintly legible beneath a crust of ancient ice, were the bold Cyrillic letters, VOSTOK-B. The spherical hull was incredibly thick, visibly designed to withstand the crushing, astronomical pressures of the ocean floor. There were absolutely no tracks leading to it, no abandoned supply trucks, no sign of any entry or heavy lifting equipment nearby. It was as if it had been dropped from the sky. Just a perfectly circular, heavy-pressure hatch on the top, sealed shut by a massive, central iron wheel. I stood there in the swirling snow, lowering my face mask just to listen. The silence around the sphere was not peaceful. It was dead. A profound, unnatural, echoing void. There were no birds. No wind whistling in the trees, because there was nothing living for 100 miles in any direction. Just a low-frequency, almost subsonic vibration radiating directly from the iron sphere. It was a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated directly through the thick ice and into the soles of my heavy tactical boots. I climbed onto the frozen hull, my boots slipping on the rusted curve, and gripped the central hatch wheel with both hands. It was impossibly cold, burning right through the thick layers of my tactical gloves. I strained with my entire body, my muscles screaming in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the rust cracked in loud, sharp snaps that echoed like gunfire across the infinite ice. The heavy internal gears ground together with a sickening, metallic shriek that echoed endlessly into the foggy void. The massive iron threshold finally yielded, swinging outward on heavily corroded hinges and revealing a pitch-black, silent, perfectly circular void below. I carefully stepped over the edge, dropping down into the belly of the beast, and turned on my powerful chest-mounted tactical flashlight. The air inside was completely dead, smelling heavily of ozone, stale copper, and ancient machine oil. I had been inside for barely 3 seconds, my flashlight beam sweeping across the vintage military green-painted dials, the complex analog machinery, and thick bundles of hardened rubber cables, when my beam suddenly swept across the open hatchway above me, leading back to the gray light of the ice. In that exact millisecond, without any warning, without any mechanical failure, the massive steel hatch violently slammed shut on its own with a deafening, echoing crash. The sound was like a cannon shot going off inside a sealed cathedral. The heavy iron locking bolts violently sheared forward, fusing the hatch shut and locking me inside the iron tomb. Instantly, before I could even scream, I felt the sickening, weightless lurch of the entire spherical capsule. The thick iron hull violently groaned, a sound like a dying whale. I stumbled and fell hard against a bank of analog pressure gauges as the solid ground beneath me simply fell away. Through a small, thick quartz viewport near the floor, I saw the blinding white light of the Baikal surface vanish in a fraction of a second, replaced immediately by a gray, violent flash of churning water and sharp shards of shattered ice as the massively heavy bathyscaphe plummeted beneath the miles of thick, ancient crust and plunged directly into the absolute, crushing blackness of the Siberian abyss. I scrambled to my feet in the cramped, circular cabin, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I threw myself at the overhead hatch, desperately tearing at the manual release wheel with both hands, but it was completely fused. The metal was locked tight as if it had been welded shut from the outside. I was trapped inside a multi-ton iron bowling ball in freefall. My tactical flashlight was now the only source of illumination in this plummeting coffin, casting long, frantic shadows across the curved, claustrophobic walls. I swept the bright white beam across the complex, chaotic maze of circular pressure gauges, heavy brass valves, and archaic, unreadable Soviet diagrams. I searched desperately for a radio, a flare release, an emergency buoyancy ballast switch, anything. There was absolutely nothing. I looked at the primary mechanical depth gauge bolted to the central console. It wasn't a digital readout, but a simple mechanical needle, painted in a ghostly, radioactive green lume. It was moving with agonizing, relentless smoothness across the ancient dial. 100 meters, 200 meters, 300. I could physically feel the weight of the water stacking up above me. The entire hull began to sing, a terrifying high-pitched metallic pinging sound that echoed from every direction as the immense pressure of the lake began to squeeze the steel sphere. But then the atmosphere inside the capsule began to change. With every passing 100 meters of depth, the profound, freezing silence of the abyss outside was replaced by something deeply unnatural inside. I looked down at the commander's desk, welded to the floor. Bolted to it was an analog clock. The glass was cracked, but the heavy second hand was loudly ticking. Tick, tick, tick. However, it wasn't moving forward. The sweep of the hand was impossibly smooth, carving away the seconds in reverse. Time was beginning to unravel the deeper I sank. The cool, stagnant air of the cabin began to warm rapidly, becoming thick, humid, and suffocating. It smelled faintly of burning wires, old paper, and sweat. The walls, painted that flat, depressing military green, started to faintly vibrate, blurring my vision. Then, from the dark corners of the green-painted panels, from the deep gaps between the complex analog machinery, a new kind of light began to emerge. It was not a physical glow from a broken bulb. It was a perception. A faint, impossible, bioluminescent ambient light that felt like it was bleeding directly from the terrifying reality of the Baikal abyss itself into my mind. It was a sickly mixture of amber and deep, pulsating red. I looked at the mechanical depth gauge again. 900 meters. The pressure on the outside of the iron hull was now almost 100 times what it was at the surface. I forced myself to look out the tiny 4-inch thick quartz viewport. I expected to see the absolute, profound blackness of the deep ocean, maybe the pale, blind eyes of some deep-water scavenger. Instead, out in the freezing void, a single, massive, pulsating red light appeared. It was not a submarine. It was not a bioluminescent creature. It was a colossal, jagged crystalline structure, glowing with a deep, bloody red internal light hovering weightlessly in the water column. Encircling it slowly were 3 massive, impossible rings of solid lead. It was the exact same temporal anomaly from the ghost train, buried a mile underwater. The red crystal was beating. Thump, thump, thump. With every single seismic low-frequency pulse, the iron hull of VOSTOK-B groaned, and the red light flooded through the quartz glass, filling my tiny cabin. In that terrible crimson glow, the walls of the bathyscaphe came alive. I saw them. The previous crew of 1978. They had not drowned. They had not been crushed. They were integrated. I watched in absolute paralyzing horror as human faces, formed out of the solid green-painted iron and rusted gears, pushed outward from the bulkheads. Their features were fused perfectly with the dials and valves. Their eyes were locked wide open, staring at me with an agonizing, conscious intensity. The crystal was not just shining light. It was broadcasting their final milliseconds of existence on an endless, looping frequency. Their iron mouths opened in a formless, silent scream that vibrated directly into my skull, trapping me in the sensory nightmare of men who had been painfully merging with cold steel for 40 years. I unholstered my sidearm with shaking hands, aiming it blindly at the iron faces emerging from the walls. I knew the weapon was completely useless, a pathetic chunk of metal against a cosmic temporal anomaly, but I needed to grip something tangible to keep my mind from shattering. The air in the capsule was now incredibly thick, heavy with the phantom heat of a dozen panicked bodies, reeking of raw terror and copper blood that wasn't there. My breathing was labored, each gasp scraping my throat. I stared in sheer disbelief at the mechanical depth gauge on the main console. The glowing green needle had hit 1,642 meters. The ultimate, absolute bottom of Lake Baikal. We had impacted the trench floor, but there was no sound of a crash, no violent shake. We were simply hanging there in the crushing dark. And then the true horror began. The mechanical dial didn't just stop at the bottom. The needle violently twitched and then started moving backward. 1,600. 1,400. We were not rising to the surface. Time itself was collapsing, pulling the entire capsule into an inverted cycle controlled by the pulsating red heart outside the glass. I realized with a sudden, freezing clarity what was happening. If the massive red crystal outside made another deep, resonant pulse, the timeline would fully reset. I wouldn't just die. My physical body would be unraveled, turned to a pile of gray ash on the grated floor, and my face would be dragged into the cold green metal of the bulkheads to join the screaming chorus of the previous crew for eternity. I was no longer just sitting in a bathyscaphe. I was standing at the epicenter of a broken reality. The interior of the capsule began to distort violently. Gravity shifted. Small droplets of condensation that had formed on the cold iron walls suddenly detached and began to float upward, perfectly spherical, drifting toward the ceiling. The faces in the walls writhed harder, their silent screams reaching a fever pitch inside my brain. I had to break the loop. I couldn't go back up the hatch. It was fused. I looked wildly around the cabin and saw it, the manual emergency ballast blowout lever. It was hidden behind a tangle of rusted pipes, painted in faded yellow and black stripes. It was designed to violently eject the inner pressure sphere from the outer heavy hull in the event of a catastrophic failure. I threw myself across the zero-gravity cabin, floating weightlessly for a split second before slamming my shoulder hard against the pipes. I grabbed the heavy iron lever with both gloved hands. It was completely frozen, rusted solid with 40 years of decay. The red light from the viewport flared with a blinding, agonizing intensity. The hum of the VOSTOK-B structure pitched up into a deafening, bone-shattering mechanical scream. The loop was seconds away from resetting. I screamed, pulling the lever with every ounce of pure, desperate adrenaline my body could produce. The thick rubber of my gloves tore. Blood vessels in my eyes burst. The rusted iron bolts violently sheared off with a sound like a grenade detonation. The lever snapped down. Instantly, explosive bolts in the hull detonated. The floor blew outward, and a catastrophic wave of freezing, highly pressurized water violently ripped into the cabin. I was sucked backward, tumbling violently into a blinding, gray-violet static of the temporal void, spinning helplessly as the crushing water and the red light consumed everything. And then absolute nothingness. I slammed face first into something hard. My lungs convulsed, vomiting up freezing water. I was not crushed at the bottom of the lake. A massive, deafening rush of freezing air and returning gravity knocked the remaining wind out of me. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. My tactical gloves were pressed deep into soft, dry Arctic snow. I looked around, gasping violently. The blinding blizzard had cleared. I was sitting on the solid, pristine black ice of Lake Baikal under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. I scrambled to my feet, looking for the heavy iron sphere of the bathyscaphe. It was completely gone. But the ice where it had been resting was not empty. There was a perfectly circular, glowing trench melted 50 feet deep into the miles-thick ice, radiating a faint orange heat that hissed against the falling snowflakes. VOSTOK-B had vanished back into the void. My chest heaved as I raised my left arm to check my tactical GPS wrist unit. The satellite signal was back, but the screen was covered in thick static. Through the glitching lines, the coordinates read exactly the same. But the digital date flashing in the corner had changed. It blinked in bright red text. System error. Date shifted backward 3 days. The time loop had not been destroyed. It had simply rejected me. I stood alone on the infinite expanse of the frozen sea, realizing the horrifying truth. The Red Crystal Anomaly is not dead. It's waiting patiently under the ice for the next keeper.